Of the 13 episodes that make up the Ninth Doctor's only series, I think you'd be hard-pressed to make a case for any episode other than this one being the least interesting and least consequential. There's better and there's worse, there's more intelligent and more stupid, there's basically every shade other than this episode's rather bland beige. This episode is it's like a glass of milk. It's there, it looks boring, it tastes bland, you're not really inclined to give it a good review because of how little impression it's made, and frankly you'd be hard-pressed to describe anything particularly great or inspiring about it, but you'd have to admit it could be worse, and I think that's the best way to describe this episode. It's not even bad enough to be particularly remarkable, and aside from some pretty mild setup for the finale, you could probably skip it and only end up wondering where Adam went after the end of the Dalek, and frankly, would anyone really care? Before I get into the episode proper, which will mostly just be me using thesaurus.com and plugging in boring and repeating the results, I should point out this episode is frequently regarded as the Ninth Doctor's weakest, coming last in all 3 Doctor Who magazine polls since 2005. And while I personally think the Slovene two-parter is weaker overall, this episode is at least not quite as brazenly stupid as that, it's difficult to argue with this sentiment, because if there's one thing you can't accuse this era of being as a whole, it's being lifeless and directionless. And yet this episode is pretty lifeless and directionless, with a plot suitable for maybe around half the running time, a disinterest in exploring any of its themes and ideas, and rounded up with Simon Pegg chewing the scenery while everyone else is bored flat or both. Doctor Who and the drying paint would probably be about as interesting to watch, and indeed review, but I'm stuck with this one for 2 reasons, both to do with my ongoing look at the Daleks, and both to do with the fact that the finale of this series is the next Dalek story on the list. Firstly, as I said, there's a bit of setup for the finale here, not much, but the locale of Satellite 5 will be reused for important narrative reasons, and definitely not so they could get their money's worth from the sets, and the plot of this episode will relate to the plot of that one, if even in a pretty minor way. Secondly, after this I'll only have to review the Empty Child two-parter, and then that means the finale can be the last Ninth Doctor story I review. A good opportunity to combine the two, I thought, as it's unlikely it'll be something I'll be able to do for any of the other Doctors. Which unfortunately means, however, I'm stuck with this episode. And if that sounds like I'm waffling, well, it's only because I am. I think I'd have a better chance of filling out 20 minutes talking about the life cycle of dung beetles, and that would be impressive given I know nothing about dung beetles, and... Alright, fine. The long game. Let's start with the production as always, and this episode does actually have a bit of importance in regards to the overall production of Doctor Who, as the slip in production of Series 1 meant that this had to be filmed basically at the same time as the aforementioned Empty Child two-parter in order to get them all finished on time, by scheduling scenes with Adam in this episode and Jack in the two-parter at different times so that Eccleston and Piper could be in the right place at the right time. Now this was consequential because it's what gave birth to the Dr. Light episode. So we have this episode to thank for Love and Monsters. Already that's a mark against it. Anyway, in terms of the actual production, this episode was directed by Brian Grant, who had a long and illustrious Doctor Who career, if you count long as 45 minutes and illustrious as managing to get the episode on the screen. Yes, this is his only episode, whether his never returning was just due to scheduling or things like that, or whether he had something to do with behind-the-scenes battles of Series 1 that we know happened but don't really know any details about, we don't know and are unlikely to know anytime soon. I wouldn't say it was because of the work on screen, which is the definition of fine. It's workmanlike, it gets the job done without being flashy, but also without being particularly interesting either. In the end, I think most of the issues with the episode are in the script, so I can't really blame him for the problems like the poor pacing or anything like that. If the words are not on the page, then what was he supposed to do? Like, so many of these scenes bore me to tears. Adam talking with a nurse played by Tamsin Greig feels like it's about to go on for about 7 hours, but again, if that sort of wasn't the page, what was he supposed to do? Especially in Doctor Who's budget. I mean, he could have added some visual distraction, a bustling medical centre and interesting cases to look at, but that would have been expensive, so it wouldn't have been possible, and ultimately just a sticking plaster over the lack of anything interesting going on in the script. So I'll give him a pass and say, especially given there's no other Who work to judge, that he was dealt a bad hand and did the best he probably could. As an aside, Grant is probably best known as a director of various music videos in the 80s, most notably Physical by Olivia Newton-John of all things. Yes, really. Before you wonder what RTD had been smoking before having this guy on, he has done a lot of TV as well, but it's funny how there ends up being a Doctor Who connection for basically everything. As for the rest of production, well, Satellite 5 is, to be honest, not the best bit of production design I've ever seen. It seems quite unimaginative, if I'm honest, essentially just the big rooms with metal walls. New Who got a lot better at this quickly. Compare, for instance, the asteroid base from the Satan Pit two-parter the next year, and you'll see what I mean, but ultimately that's a small thing. It's not like Warriors of the Deep Bad where it kills the story. It just looks a bit dull. Otherwise, there's not really much to say. Which brings us on to the script, as it appears I don't have much of a choice. This episode was penned by Mr. Russell himself, and he's obviously a bit of a punching bag in these times, and, well, after everything we had to see, deservedly so. And well, maybe all that, and the passage of time, and Doctor Who being around feeling so normal for so long, diminishes the achievement of bringing the show back at all. RTD made Doctor Who mainstream, and I think it would be to not give him his due credit to suggest that his particular writing style and story choices were not a big factor in that. Making it about the people and the relationships, more about a human drama than just a sci-fi drama, that was probably what was needed to bring the show into the 21st century. So that credit I will give him, but I would argue that this was frequently taken too far, to the point where we got one or two things: melodrama, see Doomsday, or those elements just feeling forced and out of place, and this episode is an example in my mind of the latter. Apparently this storyline was one RTD submitted to Doctor Who production office in the final years of the classic series, where Andrew Cartmel politely declined it, suggesting that it lacked those human elements that RTD would later fully embrace. If at first you don't succeed in all that, and I suppose it's encouraging he managed it, but the addition of these elements feel forced. The Doctor's constant mention of Adam being Rose's boyfriend, for instance, even though we know he's obviously not. But we have to say that so that we make sure Doctor Who knows relationships and sexy stuff exists, even when it's not really appropriate to mention. All the way the Doctor and Rose interact with all the hand-holding and stuff is like, yeah, we get it, it's not like it was in the past, we understand. I don't know, I suppose it's a very minor thing. But most things in this story count as a very minor thing, so here we are. And I think it's indicative of RTD's rather all-or-nothing approach. It would always be how he'd write Doctor Who. It would always embrace these aspects, maybe just a bit too far. And I think we recently saw that in the previous series, did we not? It's also, I think, indicative of the problems of this episode, and to an extent RTD's writing as well, because the problem was misidentified. And I suppose that reflects on Cartmel, but we don't know how much attention he actually paid it back then. But anyway, the problem was not enough human drama. Or, well, it might have been, I don't know. Perhaps there was even less happening in the broadcast version in that original treatment. But the human drama as such just feels tacked on at best and completely irrelevant at worst. I mean, yeah, there's that stuff I mentioned, but that's just, like, surface stuff. And in terms of actual depth, the Doctor and Rose barely have any kind of character arc at all in this. The Doctor goes from thinking Adam is useless to thinking he's useless and also a prick. And Rose's reaction to having invited this Playlook on board is basically to act like it was never really her idea to begin with, rather than, say, learning something from it. And all the supporting characters have no personalities. Kafka just complains about not being promoted without learning anything actually about her, etc. and so forth. So the human drama is weak and ineffectual, but again, that's not the problem, because even if it hadn't been, even if it had been top-notch like it had been the week before in Dalek, it wouldn't have mattered, because the plot is absurdly weak and nothing it brings up is remotely explored or developed. Adding the Doctor talking about his companion having a boyfriend adds nothing, because it's a weak story with no stakes and no depth. Focusing on human drama and character is fine. I'd say that's even the better way of doing storytelling. I think the best kind of storytelling is when you focus on character, but you can't do that at the expense of having a plot that actually comes together and works. That's very important as well, and that can make the whole thing fall apart, as it does here. The plot, as it is, suffers from three major problems. The first, and the one I have the least to say about, is that its commentary on the power of the media is ham-fisted and simplistic. You will find very little part of me willing to actually stand up and defend those tossers, of course, but the controlling our minds through mass media stuff is kind of political message hammered in that would make the people who made the pert we hear would blush. Like, come on, you're not saying anything new there, are you? It's just you venting, Russell. And unless you have an argument to make, a debate to have, a genuine moral quandary to consider, of which there are plenty surrounding this topic, then you shouldn't bother. And let me make it clear, that doesn't mean you have to both sides it or not come out on one side or the other. You can come out and say that you feel this one way, but you need to have the debate on it. You need to explore it. You can't just come out and say, this is what I think the bad guys would say, and therefore it's wrong. You have to do more than that. And the best political Doctor Who always does. Malcolm Hulke was not exactly candid about his political views, and yet he managed that. If a card-carrying communist can do it, then you can, Russell. But I don't really have much else to say about that, because, well, that's all there is really to it. New Who is hideously unsubtle about current issues and politics, news at 11. Or of a mass media empire-controlled news at 11. Number 2 is that the plot itself is just ridiculously weak. Over the course of the 45 minutes, there's maybe plot to fill 20 minutes, if I'm being generous. We get introduced to the mind chip stuff over the course of a good 15 minutes or so, which is really as riveting as it sounds, before obviously dead supporting character number 8372 gets promoted, and oh look, promotion means death. What an entirely original plot development that absolutely nobody in the audience would have seen coming. This, when combined with Adam's very slow exploration of the future, takes genuinely about half the episode, before we move on to the Doctor and Rose going to explore, having the plot exposited to them by the editor, which doesn't take very long as there's not much of it, where we find out the baddie's very simple plan, before Kafka uses the hitherto unknown make all the systems explode setting of the mind ship to save the day. Now, that's glib on my part, but only just, as those tiny bits of plot essentially make up the entire episode. That and Adam's stuff, which can be summarised in one sentence. He's a greedy idiot who wants all the future technology and accidentally almost ruins everything by trying to do it before getting kicked out. Why do you think we spent the running time at a Godfather, and he says like that's how long it felt, with Tamsin Greig explaining the ins and outs of how the chip works? Because there's nothing of actual substance for him to do. In the main plot, not only is there only barely actual substance, I can't think of a single plot point off the top of my head that wasn't told rather than shown. Which, to be fair, is particularly easy, as there's only maybe about 4 plot points at most. This leads me into problem number 3, which is the biggest. None of this plot has any actual development or depth to it, and it is the biggest because on its own is what causes the issues. The threadbare plot elements on their own could have been built up into something more substantial by taking the many threads on offer and, I don't know, doing something with them. For instance, instead of the fact that everyone who gets promoted to Floor 500 never coming back being relayed by Kathaka as if it's a minor tidbit, oh, by the way, nobody who gets promoted is ever seen again. Funny that, how about actually, I don't know, exploring it? What's been done about it? How the people down there balance the worry about what happened to them with the zeal for promotion and advancement? And perhaps even exploring that, some kind of culture of ambition. Something that definitely it does exist in our own media in real life. Instead of pointing out, obviously dead supporting character number 8372 is an anarchist spy, or whatever the hell, killing her and then never mentioning it again, how about looking into that? What the anarchists want? What that says about Earth as it is and the society that's been built up? Are they right? Are they not? I don't know, explore these things. Or indeed, have a look at what this Earth Empire is like, whether it's a peaceful empire or an expansionist one, or rather given the context of the story, what the humans think it is. Oh, and the Doctor constantly points out my lack of aliens, which I don't think ever really actually gets satisfactorily resolved. Like, yeah, the Jaggerfest is enslaving humanity, but why not all the potential alien immigrants as well? What, from its point of view, is an evil alien monster slaver makes humans so important in that regard? Speaking of which, the Jaggerfest's explanation for why it's exclaiming the human race through mass media manipulation is they want slaves. No actual motivation other than evils, of course. And when the Jaggerfest is no more than a job for the caretaker and his mop, what happens to the Earth Empire? And that's not even all of them. It's just obvious plot elements that could have been looked at and expanded and developed to give some actual meat to the episode, something to think about, something to explore. But they all end up as just plot points mentioned and exposition as a means of journeying to the end of the episode and going no further. None as actual storylines or themes or anything like that to explore. As for the characters, well, I already said the Doctor and Rose are flat and nothing this episode. They had no arcs, nothing to learn, nothing to explore about themselves. I'm just there to be the recipients of exposition. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Rose to learn a lesson about sharing the TARDIS with anyone she feels like with what happens with Adam. And yeah, maybe that would have been the mistake just before Father's Day, but it would have been something. As their smugness at Adam at the end of the episode is just nauseating. I think this is the first episode we get a sign of just how insufferable she can be. Rose, you threw him into this without thinking about it, so I'm not sure what you're acting all superior about, given all this nonsense is basically your fault, and the Doctor not actually recognising that is a major first step in the making Rose perfect and always right about everything stuff that would become a much bigger problem the next year, but it's just as insufferable here. It really feels like everything is being lumped on everyone else because they can make no mistakes, and that's not a good way to write your heroes, and I think it is the sign that Russell had begun to get a little high on his own supply even this early. And yeah, as I said, maybe exploring all that would have been a mistake just before Father's Day, but it should have been RTD's job to make it work, or find some other way to explore it, rather than just having Adam be the scapegoat for everything. Not that I like Adam's character, of course, as in I think he's a good person or a well-written character. It was suggested by Grant, the director, in case you've forgotten his name, so I'm led to believe anyway. There was at one point a subplot about Adam having a terminally ill father, which gave him, a genuinely strong motivation to want to look for all that future stuff, something to actually explore the morals behind and give the Doctor a genuine choice as to what he thinks about it. Perhaps sympathetic, but nevertheless standing firm, that however understandable it may be, the damage to time cannot be allowed to happen. Or perhaps his post-Time War Doctor still only reacts with hostility. So many other people suffer from family tragedies themselves. What makes him different? And I'm not saying either one of those is correct or wrong, I'm just saying that would have been something to explore, a moral quandary. And well, it would have given us depth, interest, character drama, character change with the Doctor and Adam, and that was obviously not what we were able to have here. So that was excised, and Adam is just a dick. As I said though, this is kind of on Rose for taking him along without bothering to think it through in the first place, and the Doctor for just going along with it and letting this clearly unsuitable guy just wander off into the future. So it's difficult really to go along entirely with this Adam is a wanker theme they're going for, and that culminates at the end with the Doctor kicking him off, because the only question I can ask is, what did you expect was going to happen? You put someone like him in that situation, what do you think he's going to do? And yeah, before you ask, the idea of what someone would happen if you put someone average with all the flaws in the average person in that situation, i.e. precisely that, goes entirely uncommented on and explored, but of course. It doesn't help, of course, his storyline is as poorly paced as the rest of the episode, which makes it frankly incoherent and confusing. He's all confused and overwhelmed at the start of the episode before excusing himself, so in reality he can find a computer terminal and start nabbing all the future tech information. Okay, so he was just pretending so we take advantage of the situation. He's more in tune with it than he looks. Well, no, because we have to go through the whole fucking nurse scene, which, as I believe I've mentioned once or twice, is a bit of a fucking long slog, where he's back to being the confused and overwhelmed fish out of water while we have every single function of the chip explained to us in great detail, and also get to see frozen vomit. Lovely. So it's confusing what we're actually going for here, and that's entirely lost because the whole thing is stretched out to absurd lengths. After all, if he wasn't completely lost, then he wouldn't need everything except how to go to the toilet explained to him by Tandem Greek, and that scene might be slightly shorter than the running length for the Daleks' master plan. As for the supporting characters, they're all boring. Kafka is a cutout who has no journey and learns nothing. She wants promotion and then saves the day by not wanting promotion, or maybe wanting it, who knows. Frankly, who cares at this point? I already mentioned obviously dead supporting character number 8,372, who might as well have started planning her funeral the moment she got promoted, and probably earlier, and being that predictable just makes the audience find her boring. Which she is, because she has no real personality. And that's about it, unless you count the nurse, and I don't, because I'm sick of moaning about that boring scene. Which leads me to the villain, well, both of them. The Jagrafess is this CGI anus, which, as I mentioned earlier, is in the middle of enslaving the human race. How is explained, I suppose, but a big question of why is left dangling, as whether the Jagrafess is its name or its species. If the latter, then there are loads of other Jagrafy that are part of this plan, and therefore blowing up this one has achieved the square root of fuck all. And yes, before you start, I know, it's actually the Daleks. This is the connection to the finale. It turns out this is all part of their grand plan. But that comes with two issues. First, it still leaves the resolution in this episode alone unsatisfying. And second, what need do they have for this giant boil to do all their manipulating for them? Other than in the case the Doctor turned up and needed to see something other than a Dalek doing all the dirty work, I failed to see why any of this was actually necessary, and frankly I question how on earth this thing got up to this point without anyone noticing anyway. Yeah, it's just a requisition form for a giant ceiling hole for this enormous zit to live in. Nobody's going to ask any questions about that. And then there's the editor, played by Simon Pegg, who I do like, don't get me wrong, I love Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead and all that. He's done loads of brilliant things over the years, but this performance is not one of them. I'll give him that there's a bit of life to the performance compared with everyone else who is dull and flat, but a bit of life is just underselling it a bit, as he spends the whole episode munching on the scenery, and it's just bad. Distractingly over the top, and not in a way that adds anything to it either. It's not actually funny, and it's certainly not menacing or anything like that. It's just kind of ridiculous and annoying. The character is just a dull generic villain, in it for power and money, and nothing that makes his motivation interesting, and his back and forth for the Doctor is weak as a result, because there's nothing for the Doctor to really bounce off. It also goes back and forth between his controlling, domineering figure and a Smithers-like toady going off every grunt the Jagrafess makes, making him feel inconsistent as a villain figure. His death as a hands of the zombified form of obviously that supporting character number 8,372 therefore doesn't feel particularly karmic, as there's no motivation for it to really be behind it, given how generally inconsistent it has felt. So the villain side of things is overall weak as well. So I've mostly been on about things I don't like. Is there anything I actually do? Well, not technically. I like some of the ideas, I suppose, and as I just explained at great length, it's not as if they do anything with any of them, and it's difficult to give RTD any credit for writing down some bullet points, and that's it. So, I suppose the one big thing I can say for this episode is that it's at least inoffensive. It's just boring and bland and beige. Nothing interesting happening or going on, but at least that means there's nothing particularly egregious or stupid either. No farting aliens, no excuses for domestic abuse, no paving slab blowjobs, no ridiculous CGI giant scorpions. I could go on, but I shan't, for it's too depressing. But at least this episode is nothing like that. It came, occupied 45 minutes of television in a way that did not interest me in the slightest, and left, and, well, it could have been worse. I suppose it is the definition of damning with faint praise, but if the worst you are is boring and uninteresting when you've done better than pretty vast waves of New Who. So we'll just get right to it, because I have literally nothing else to talk about, and I have pondered about the final score. I'm not sure how I really should judge this one. Given that, while there's not really much I could say I particularly liked about it, what was bad was mostly just boring and uninteresting. It didn't really go out to town with the badness as New Who very frequently can. So, this might sound like a bit of whiplash given all I talked about, but I'm going to give this score a final score of 4 out of 10. which, again, you may think is high given how I've had literally nothing positive to say about it, but all that means is that it is slightly below average even by New Who standards. And I can't justify going down to a 3 when that's the same score I gave crap like The Lazarus Experiment or Deep Breath, episodes filled with stupid, idiotic nonsense, which this episode lacks, as someone's trying to speak dinosaur in this, for instance. But there's no question it's below average. It's bland, boring, underdeveloped, and only really notable for a tiny bit of setup for the finale. The character stuff doesn't work, the plot is threadbare, and every idea is left underdeveloped. It's deeply unimpressive, but at least I didn't have to hear any electric light orchestra, so there's that. Anyway, the next time we look at New Who will be a much better story than this one, The Empty Child two-parter, to finish Ninth Doctor's run aside from the finale, which will come not much longer after that. But next time, it's back to Classic Who with The Web of Fear.